boy. Okay. I have to say, just completely overwhelmed by this book. I'm trying to I've let us into a cave, and now I don't know how to get us out. There's just we started doing the book of Job last week, and you should check out that video if you weren't with us last week, because I'm starting to feel like just trying to do like a session on the book of Job, you know what I mean? And then I realized I have to do a second session, and now I have to tell you we're going to be doing Job next week as well. This at least requires 2 more sessions, because tonight we're going to hear God's response, famous response, and it's this that I thought of. This is how I got us into this. Okay, we did Baruch Hinachi. We did this beautiful naturalistic psalm describing the natural world in such a vivid and beautiful way. And I thought, oh my gosh, having done that, we ought to go to the book of Job to hear God's great response from out of the storm, from out of the whirlwind. I think there's a book called Out of the Whirlwind, right, which is a reference to this moment that will begin our evening tonight. But it's like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna encapsulate God's response in like 1 hour's time. And it's 4 chapters long. I mean, there's just so much here that we'll have to do part 3 next week. But more than that, I don't know how to. It's so much. I don't know how to cope with all of the linguistic complexity, because after all, our subject is poetry, and I want to make sure that we treat this like a poem, and maybe the greatest poem in the Bible. I mean, you heard Robert Alter, who I've been using a lot for this. You heard Robert Alter last week refer to the book of Job as the greatest of biblical poetry, and compared its author to Shakespeare. Right? That's a pretty full-throated endorsement. And having said that, this, says Alter, is the greatest of the great. This is the climax of the book of Job. Now, having said that, there's another huge dealing with the greatest epic poem the Bible has to offer is certainly challenging enough. But along with that, it is also the most troubling theological discourse in the Bible. It deals, after all, just to repeat the basics, it deals with a man who was described as pure and righteous in every way, and God was so proud of that guy that God called out to his celestial array and said, "Oh, look at my servant Job. Nobody's like Job." And Hasatan, the adversary, the Satan, said, "Oh, sure, Job is faithful to you because he's had such an easy life, but give him some trial and you'll see just how soon he curses you." So, and then remarkably, God does that. And that's sort of the problem with the whole book, is that God's like, "Oh yeah, we'll see," and just tortures Job, kills his entire family, and afflicts him with painful disease all over his body. And Job, and this is the reason we never got to God last week, because Job's response is in itself such a heart-stopping moment. And we spent our entire time considering Job's poem, Job's great account of his own suffering. And he cursed the day he was born, and didn't curse God. Interestingly, that was the whole game. He didn't curse God, but he cursed the day he was born, cursed himself, and essentially. Again, you should take a look at it. It was a good discussion last week, but essentially the message, we'll refer back to it a little bit in terms of imagery, but the message was annihilate me. I don't want to be. I don't want to have been. Annihilate me from the moment of birth, from the moment of conception. Do away with me. And then soon enough, we saw that Job was essentially saying, annihilate everything. This world is worthless. Nihilism, is that the right word for it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because it isn't exactly meaninglessness. It is the response to great suffering. Great suffering. And annihilate the world, annihilate creation. We saw Job undo the world. And I think you all saw this better than I did as we began to map it out. There was a kind of like, do away with the lights themselves, then do away with the stars, then do away with the plants, then do away with the animals. But mostly do away with us. Mostly do away with us. This is not worth it. This is not worth it. Okay, so then there's this massive book for nearly 40 chapters of Job's friends trying to provide him with some kind of, well, look at it this way, look at it this way, the many theologies of the book of Job. And that is a college course. That is a whole semester to deal with all the theologies of the book of Job. But we're not going to deal with Eliphaz HaTemani's theology, and we're not going to deal with Job's friends' theology. We're going to go straight to the source. We're going to deal with God's response, and it is phrased as a response, V'yan, and God answered Job. And as I said last week, it is not going to be satisfying. It isn't satisfying. It doesn't seem to be meant to be satisfying. And it's even, I would say, it's more than unsatisfying. It's terribly disappointing. This is it. This is our great kind of statement on human suffering. What God says here will be a comfort to no one. Or will it? I don't know. Let's see what we can unearth. But I do want us to work at it, because it would be too easy in this majestic book to dismiss its climax as, well, theologically problematic. I don't like that. God's being a real jerk here, which, it's kind of true. We'll soon see. But I don't believe that a book that tackles questions of this sophistication with language of this sophistication could be saying something so blunt and simple at the end. Okay, we're going to be dealing with this now for a couple of weeks, but let's begin. And along the way, we are just going to see some of the most gorgeous Hebrew that the history has ever had to offer. Okay, so in we go. We're going to head right in this week, and as we often do, we're just going to take the first couple of lines because they'll set a tone for us. And as I've already said, just the first phrasing is already so interesting. God speaking to Job out of the tempest. Okay, so here are your source sheets for the evening. Let me just make sure I have them all right here. Okay, here are your source sheets for the evening. Now I'm going to give you a few things. I'm going to give you the source sheet, which is just a sheet that I put together that we'll be looking through. Okay, then I'm going to give you the actual just like reference in Safari, the kind of linear arrangement, which may be easier to follow. My edited version of my own sheet is easy for me to follow, but the actual source in Safari is probably easier to track. If you're looking at both the Hebrew and the English, you might want that. And then finally, if you want it, here's the source sheet from last week. We'll make reference to it sometimes, and it may be useful to you. Just as a kind of one last little, crib notes, kind of like one last little guiding piece of information. There's the source sheet from last week. Okay, lots of source sheets. But as usual, you don't need any of them. I'm going to share it with you on the screen. If you will recall, and it's important to keep in mind that the major themes from last week, from Job's great statement of despair, were just poetically. When we notice imagery, we notice themes of birth, right? Job dealing with themes of birth, conception, all these things. Themes of light and darkness that moved throughout. And then, of course, the major theme, which was nature. And you will see God responding to Job, really responding to Job, because here we are 35 chapters later, and God remembers what happened in chapter 3, and God is talking to Job. It's as if everything else between then has just been intense reckoning and conversation, but now God responds. Okay, so here we go, and we head into the tempest. Okay, so let me make the screen a little. We should donate to Safaria. I should donate to Safaria, to Ikar, all the great organizations that need money on giving. It's Wednesday now, but keep giving. Okay, here we go. Then the Eternal One replied to Job out of the tempest and said, V'yan Adonai et Iyov min has'ara v'yomer. Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking words without knowledge? Mize machshich etza v'milin bli da'at. Gird your loins like a man. I will ask, and you can inform me. Ezarna chagever chalatzecha ve'eshalcha v'hodieni. Okay, now let's start slow here. God speaks to Job out of the tempest, min hasara. So let's just start there. What a remarkable opening. God speaking out of the tempest. And what God is this? How does this set a tone? I already see Jonathan's got a hand up, please.
So I think there's an unambiguous reference here to Elijah's event in the cave, where there's this enormous storm all around the cave, and the Book of Kings tells us God was not in the storm. And we read through, all these different calamities, and it turns out that God is this, thin silence that's internal. So whatever God this is in Job, it is speaking out of the storm, right? Is not an internal, well, I don't know, maybe that's too far of a read, but there's this tension between the God that lives inside of the challenged man, whether that's Elijah or Job, and the God that's external.
Excellent. I'm snapping. I was snapping all along. That was just great. This is not kol dmama daka. This is not the still small voice. This is not that God. This is the God of the storm. And ellipses, a God of the storm who storms, who rages, who is the loud God. Right. Matt.
So two things. One, I actually hear back to Genesis because that's God and the chaos, and the tempest to me is somewhat of the chaos. So I'm hearing not that small still voice, but that grand original voice. But also because you said the tempest, because this is my thing, it's El, I think, who was originally a storm god if you look at, it's either El or Yahweh, I don't remember which. One of them was a storm god. So this is for that view, also a very primitive, direct, this is the original guy. This isn't something that you've added to. This is the original.
Good. Okay. Both of Matt's points excavate for us the naturalistic nature of God itself here. Right? God is the primal force. Matt imagines that that's even pre-creation, the storminess of all. But Matt also, by referencing other religious traditions, reminds us of gods that are thought of as primarily manifesting through the great storminess force of nature. Okay, and we're going to see things get so vividly naturalistic that that's an important thing to keep in mind, that God is speaking to Job. And remember, I mean, this is a metaphor, right? It's like this, on some level, this is, I mean, it's poetry. So nature is speaking to Job. Nature provides the response in a way. Okay, let me just highlight a couple of other things in these first lines. Who is this who darkens counsel? Machshich etza. So it's a little bit like darkening your door, who shows up and provides counsel, right? Or who like gives dark counsel. But this is very important language. This language of darkness, because we said last week that Job was living in darkness. Job was speaking from darkness. Job wanted to extinguish the light. And let me also point out that although this is very kind of almost macho gendered language here, right? Gird your loins like a man. So that sounds very like in some ways like out of step, not just with like, with our theologies, but also just sort of like, so there's something very kind of like warlike and primitive about it. But remember last week that Job was referred to himself as the man that was conceived on that day, right? It was a strange language. So God is responding directly and saying like, oh, you're a man? You're a man? Okay, stand up like a man. And this is what I want to ask you about. This is such a strange way to begin. I'm going to ask you questions and you see if you can answer me. What a strange, God is about to start explaining the way everything works. And what God says is, I'm going to pose a few problems to you. See if you gird your loins like a man and see if you can provide me a response. Whoa, like what's aggressive, anyone? Right? Like what is God already doing by setting the terms in this way? Yael and then Michal.
I feel a similarity between Yaakov wrestling with Haish, who sometimes we believe might be Jacob himself. And I think this could possibly be interpreted as Job has indulged his anger and his grief and his pain, and then he could be saying to himself, he's a man of faith. He's a man of God. And then he says, get up, get over it. Where was I when God created the heavens and the earth? I don't know anything about God or his rationale or the way the universe runs. And he says, just look at it differently instead of indulging your heart.
Okay. This is useful, what Yael is giving us, because she already sees an answer. In some ways, we already have God's answer, don't we? And I saw in the chat also, I usually don't track the chat, but I saw it pop up, that Joe Schwartz says, it seems like God's telling Job to suck it up, which is like, right, in some ways, this seems to be the answer, is get over it. Like, you don't understand, and this is what Yael provided, and this will be, in some ways, the basic message of God's response is, you have no idea, you can't understand, and stop indulging almost in your misery. I mean, now God just tortured this guy. I mean, I don't like this answer, but on one level, this is going to be the basic answer. Right? Okay, Micha.
So I wasn't able to be here last week. I don't know if you went over this, but the language here is the language of the courtroom. And I don't know if you went over the history of the Satan as the, so
a little bit.
Okay,
Yeah,
so,
give it to us.
So in the Persian court, which is where the tradition of the Satan comes from, the Satan was the sort of the prosecuting attorney. And that was his job. He wasn't Satan the way we've inherited Satan, he was actually the prosecutor. And so this is picking up the same language of the prosecution and defense and carrying it through. So it seems to me it's really setting up this dynamic of God as prosecutor and judge.
Good, good. That's very helpful. There's something's on trial here. Is God on trial? Is Job on trial? Something's on trial here, and that's exactly right. The Satan has been the prosecuting attorney, right? And then God is the ultimate judge, right? Judge, jury, and executioner, right? So yes, and this, what Michal has given us, is a way to understand what we will be, what our whole conversation tonight is framed with, which is like, okay, I'm going to be asking you questions. Let's see if you can answer my questions very lawyerly, and we will end tonight with another question, right? God will leave us on a kind of a cliffhanger of a question, okay? Okay, now just to make sure that we have material to cover, and as I've indicated, a lot of the messaging is going to be similar, though it's going to change and be nuanced in different ways. But let's just to make sure we get, if we just read these 2 chapters tonight and turned off our computers, we would have had a rich and fulfilling evening, because this is just incredibly gorgeous writing. So let's do some of that and begin to fill in Yael's understanding that this is a kind of a, who do you think you are? Don't you know who I am? Okay, so let's take a look at some of these basic claims. And Robert Alter nicely divided the poem, so at least we can conceptually keep track. And the first section he calls the cosmological, okay? So the cosmological section, and he will eventually get to the meteorological and the zoological or zoological? I think it's zoological. Okay, but then let's just see here. We start now. Okay, so I'm going to ask and you can inform me. And indeed, a lot of this is framed in the form of a question. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. Efoita beyazdi aretz, haged im yadata vina. Do you know who fixed its dimensions or who measured it with a line? Misa mimadeha kiteda, omina ta'aleha kav. Onto what were its sockets sunk? Who laid its cornerstones? Alma adaneha hatba'u, o miyara even pinata. When the morning stars sang together and all the divine beings shouted for joy, Baran yachad kochvei voker v'yariu kol b'nei Elohim. Who closed the sea behind doors when it gushed forth out of the womb? V'yasech bidlatayim yam b'gicho merechem yetzeh. When I clothed it in clouds, swaddled it in dense clouds, besumi anan levusho v'arafel chatulato. When I made my breakers my limit for it and set a bolt with double doors, v'esbor alav chuki v'asim briachud latayim, and said, you may come so far and no farther. Here your surging waves will stop. Vomar ad potavo velotosif. Ufo yashit bigon galecha. Okay. And now some of the questions, it's just like, listen to this language here, because it really is, I mean, it's just wild the way, this is God talking, you know? It's just like, who is this character? Have you ever commanded the day to break? Assigned the dawn its place? There's a little like sarcasm in here, no? All right. Hamiyamecha tzivita boker yidata hashachar mimkomo, so that it seizes the corners of the earth and shakes the wicked out of it. Le'echoz bekanfot haaretz v'yinaru reshoim mimena. It changes like clay under the seal till its hues are fixed like those of a garment. Titapech kahomer chotam v'yityatzvu kamo levush. Their light is withheld from the wicked, and the upraised arm is broken. Yimanamer Hashoim oram, uzro rama tishaver. Have you penetrated to the sources of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Havata ad nivchei yam, Uvecheker tahom yitalachta. Have the gates of death been disclosed to you? Have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Haniglu lechashare mavet, v'shari tzal mavet tire. Have you surveyed the expanses of the earth? If you know of these, tell me. Hitbonanta ad rachave aretz, hagedim yadata chula. Which path leads to where light dwells, and where is the place of darkness? Eze haderech yishkan or, v'choshech eze min komo. We'll just read a couple more verses and then I want to hear from you. That you may take it to its domain and know the way to its home. Ki tikochena el gvulo v'chi tavin nitivot beito. Surely you know, for you were born then, and the number of your years is many. Yadata ki az tivaled, umispar yamecha rabim. Right? Remember, Job started with the day he was born. So surely you know, because weren't you born then? Okay. All right. So, wow. All right. It's already like a little too much to take. But I feel like my job is to ask good questions. I don't have good questions. What do you think of this? I mean, if I have a question, it's how does God begin to deepen Yael's answer? Of how, what is this doing if the answer, as Yael said, is what do you know? You don't know anything. You don't have any idea the magnitude of my plan, right? So shut up. Or is that the answer? Okay, Noah.
Well, I think there's a cue maybe to into this language from the invitation at the beginning to speak words without knowledge, which is such a striking phrase to me, because it actually, while it could be like sarcastic, I think also could be an invitation, like what if we read this double-facedly, not as just sarcasm, but actually, wait, God is here, responding to Job, responding to Job's questions with questions of their own. And I'm seeing actually a dualism of two different types of knowledges here. God is talking of cosmic knowledges, of divine knowledges that man, specifically Job, doesn't maybe know about cosmic order, like, how the universe is designed. But what's interesting to me is that he's using anthropomorphic language to animate everything that he's saying, or I shouldn't say he, I'm sorry. God's animacy is describing something in incredibly anthropomorphic language, yet does God know about human knowledge? Is God speaking words of which God doesn't have knowledge? There's two different experiences here, divine knowledges and non-divine knowledges. There's, the knowledge that Job has of his own pain, and the knowledge God has of the pain of the universe or the order of the universe. And I think there's a dialogue maybe that's genuinely happening here.
Thank you for all of that. Oh, I'm so grateful for you all. Such brilliant reading here. And I would just want to extract a couple of just really basic points that Noah is offering us that have to be dealt with. And one is that for all of this stormy, thundering, I will now tell you the way the world works and all that, God is inviting Job into dialogue, wants to be in dialogue, seemingly. I saw someone just saying in the chat that God seems so lonely, and one wonders, and the way Noah puts it is so interesting. That is, maybe you can answer to this, because after all, and this is the second point I want to extract from Noah's very intricate and helpful reading. This isn't an answer. I mean, it's not an answer. It is certainly a description of God's knowledge and capability and plan. But what does that have to do? I'm suffering, right? And human knowledge is relevant here, right? So I love all of that. Thank you. Alexandra, Emil, and I
do see this as comforting to me. And I think what I'm going to say ties into what Yael said and maybe also what Noah said, but I see it as God saying to to Job, look, now I'm talking to you. I wasn't talking to you before, but you've advanced to a place where I'm actually now talking to you. And your story doesn't end now. Your story isn't finished. I'm infinite. I was all the way back then. The stars are infinite, the ocean, all these like, the drops in the ocean, the waves of the ocean, all these infinite things. That's who I am. And I'm talking to you, and I'm going to teach you, like, you're on a journey. It doesn't end here. Your story isn't done. You don't know your purpose. You don't know my intentions, but now I'm speaking to you and we're going to move forward. And yeah, you've been through this, but like, you don't know who I am and you have no idea how amazing things are. So I actually do see this as a like comforting answer, and yeah, I like it. I'm with it. I like that God is kind of sassy and funny. I think God's funny.
Sassy. Yeah, the Jews and their sassy God. No, but yeah, that's a good framing and an interesting one. I mean, here is, and it builds on what Noah was saying. Here is a man in dialogue with the source of all being. And he hasn't been. So this is like, maybe this is like, you're through your suffering, you've asked the questions to get you here. And now you're seeing into the heart of everything. And maybe that is a kind of, okay, you want the answers? Like, this is what it's like. This is the force that is at the heart of all. And that's, yeah, I don't know if it's comforting, but it certainly is, as Alexander puts it, a step forward. Emil.
Somewhat similar to what everyone was saying, but like in some, it doesn't seem like much of an answer, but the language is so amazing to me, and the scope of it, and like there's this sense of awe, and it does seem like a very Jewish thing to be like, you think you have questions, like you don't even know what the questions are. There are bigger questions than the questions you have. And there is something, if not comforting, there's something that's very uplifting about it, like it's such an incredible speech, and just to sort of be transfixed by this and to be made aware of like, guess what, everything is a mystery. There's like the locks on the gates of knowledge and like the vault of the snow and all these incredible things you maybe haven't even thought of. It's humbling, like, and it's like, and if someone just came up to you and was like, oh yeah, there's no answer, what do you know? It's like, obviously that's not great, but this is like sort of like kind of God opening your eyes to like the spectacular things you don't even know to ask about. Right. And there is something uplifting about that, I find.
Yeah, I appreciate that, both on the theological level, like, actually, maybe it is an answer, which is, this is all so much bigger than any of us. And actually, yes, of course, we're concerned with our problems, but at the end of the day, human suffering is us in the vastness of all existence. It's humbling. It's humbling. And I want to just add that, isn't it perfect? If Robert Alter is right, and this is the greatest poetry of the Bible, somehow it's just perfect. Like, God is able to sum up. That's also humbling. Here is the most sophisticated language you will ever see, right? That too, like, look at what I can do. I can do everything, right? Yeah, okay. I want to take Esra, and then I want to read a little bit more, and I'll come back to, I see Florine. Esra, please.
Yeah, building off of what some have said, I think Noah talking about two different sources of knowledge, I would maybe phrase it as two different sets of experience. They're coming from different places experientially. And, we talk about like poetry having this parallel in the poetry that we read. And here we have a really interesting parallel of experiencing. And it's just so sad, because it's like Job has this intense and powerful language. And then God comes back with intense and powerful language. And Job is so isolated in his suffering. And God is so isolated in Godness. But they're really just talking past each other. And it's so sad. Job says this, and, I think God's answer, Job is talking about apples and God answers in oranges. Like, it sounds like a very defensive answer to me. I think, as you were kind of pointing to earlier, it's like, great that you can do all of these things, but you're not answering the question of morality. Like, what I'm great for making the sun rise and set and doing all that you do. That's been magnificent. So, which now leads me to believe, I don't even know if I can say this, but like, are humans like teaching God something that God doesn't know? Maybe, I don't know. Is there something there about, as Noah was saying, they're coming from different places of knowing. I would say knowing from experiencing. So is there something here that needs to penetrate? Yeah, I don't know, on the God side.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also I think a very legitimate read here is that they are as Esther says, talking past each other. And maybe if that's true, that God really doesn't get something. Now, I will just point out that there is mention, along with all there are so many things I'd love to point out here, like the, what did I want to point out? When it gushed forth out of the womb, right? When closed the sea behind doors, when it gushed forth out of the womb, I closed it in clouds, swaddled it in death, like all that language of the baby being born. God's saying, yeah, that was true for the ocean on my end, right? But Esther's saying there's a kind of like, but you're not listening, you're not hearing me, you're not addressing the question. Now, I do want to point out that there are all of these references to, to the wicked, right? Where do we see the wicked? I can't find it. Oh, there it is. So right, assign the dawn its place so that it seizes the corners of the earth and shakes the wicked out of it. And there was another reference to the wicked, and it's interesting that it's like as if the moral world is somehow implicated, as if God's doing something right, but it's very kind of like just we sort of graze by that, right? That the moral account does not seem to be here. Okay, let me just add so that we have some of the fullness of the language. Let me read now what Alter calls the meteorological section here. That is summoning not just the formation of things, but the actual workings of the natural world and its seasons. Have you penetrated the vaults of snow, seen the vaults of hail? Havata el otzrot shaleg ve'otzrot barad tireh? Which I have put aside for a time of adversity, for a day of war and battle. Asher chasachti le'etzar le'yom krav v'milchama. By what path is the west wind dispersed, the east wind scattered over the earth? Ve'ezeh derech yechalek or yafetz kadim al alei eretz? Who cut a channel for the torrents and a path for the thunderstorms? Mi filag l'shetef v'ta'ala v'derech lachaziz kolot. To rain down on uninhabited land, on wilderness where no man is. Lamtir al eretz lo ish, umidbar lo adambo. That seems to me like a significant line. Reference to a land where there are no people. To saturate the desolate wasteland and make the crop of grass sprout forth. Lasbia shoah mishoah ulatzmiach motza deshe. Does the rain, and I love does the rain have a father? Who begot the dewdrops? Hayesh matar av, omi holid egletal. So remember the language, if you were with us last week, of like the parentage and the giving birth. Well, what about the rain? What about the natural world? Were there parents there? Who birthed all that? I did, right? So, okay, let me turn now to Florine.
I've never seen a poem with that many questions. There's a long series of questions, statement, then long series of questions, statements, interspersed, but really they're not questions. The whole thing is statement.
Yeah, right.
But the technique of asking the question is more attention getting.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Florine. With her poetic eyes, sensitizing us to the rhetoric here, right? There's something, some device being employed, and it's legalistic, right, is one framework for it, and it's dialogic is another, but these aren't really questions. I was like, what is this? Who are you? How dare you? What do you, like, have you ever been there? Have you ever seen this? It's like there's it creates a certain kind of tone and rhythm, just the questioning itself. Allison, again, we've taken the cosmological, now we added the meteorological. So now we've got like the world as it works and all of the natural irrigation and seasons and all the things that have to be for everything to be in place, right? So now how have we added, I'm not saying you have to answer this question, Allison, but just like Summer, how have we added to, again, what seems like a very central claim, which is, I know things you don't. But yes, Allison.
I can totally pick up right there. I think everything we've said is really interesting, and I wanted to bring into the conversation some comments that Michal has been making in the chat, which is that this seems really abusive. Like, she noticed that it almost sounds kind of like a professor talking to a student, like, and sort of showing off how much more brilliant he is than the student ever can be, and like, do you even know about this? Do you even know about this? And that made me think of two things. One is, I remember, like, as we read through the Torah last year, that we had some conversations, especially towards the end of the Torah, in like Deuteronomy, that there does seem to be this abusiveness that happens, like, between God and Moses and the Israelites. And you and I had a private conversation about that, and you said this thing to me that God is sometimes. I think it was good. I don't know. You said, and I hope I'm remembering it correctly, but you said that God is like a metaphor for the natural world, you know? And that I've been kind of thinking about that here, because in some ways, you know, the story of Job is a really difficult one to hold, but in other ways, I feel really grateful that it exists, because otherwise we would be left with this theology that kind of suggests, like, suffering is merited. You know, like, if you do good, you will flourish, and if you do bad, you will suffer. And yet here we have this story that suggests, like, suffering isn't necessarily merited, and maybe, like, the world is just unfair.
Okay, this is great. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for raising Michal's chat points, but this point has to be made. I mean, it's not just unsatisfying, not just disappointing. This feels like horrible. This just feels horrible. Like, God is no compassion. Where's the compassion? Where's the love? Don't like so, and yet, as I said, I just find it very hard to believe that the message of this book is, you know, basically like, you know, shut the hell up. Like, that the message of this book is, I don't care, that God doesn't care. Is that, I mean, maybe so. Maybe we just accept this is a book about an abuse of God, but seeking other ways of understanding this, one of them is to think, I'm not sure if I stand by God is a metaphor for the natural world, though I think that God can be used as a metaphor for our experience of the world in all its forces. And maybe that's part of what the answer is here, is the world is just a massive and sometimes terrifying place. And God's speaking that out, but it's just like, it's just nature, man. There's just no way, like, things happen, right? And the God making them, and that's the metaphor part. But really, things just happen, right? Okay, let's see. We're coming down on the end of our time. We're nowhere near where we're supposed to be, but that's okay. Let's take one more comment, then we'll read a little more, and then try and close. I actually have to head out right at the hour tonight. But let's take a comment from Jen D.
Hello. I'm thinking of an answer in this that takes both Job's piece and God's piece and makes them kind of part of a dialectic, because you both need to have the perspective when you have trauma that the universe is much bigger than that, and that time and substance is far beyond what you're experiencing, and also that all of your experiences and your suffering are vital and essential and part of who you are as a person. So to really come out of this book, to me, with the most wisdom I can, is to actually have Job and God both be right.
Yeah, I love that. You said something last week also, Jen, that just totally blew up our whole class. I'm really appreciating your presence here. Yeah, right? Like, maybe that's the thing, is that there's there are no answers, you know, like, or that better, as Jen put it, that they're both true, right? It's both true that we can't even ask the question, and this is all too big for us. We ought to just sort of like, and it's true that our own suffering is real, and it's a problem, and it suggests some sort of great problem with the whole workings of everything, right? What could Job say back? Yeah, great, this is beautiful, but I'm hurting down here. You know, you did a great job, except when it came to my life, right? Okay, let's read a little bit more. I want to at least take us to the end. I think we will probably not cover all the material that I wanted to cover tonight, but we have to get into the zoological, right? Because that's where some of the best language is. We just saw the meteorological, and now there's a switch to. Does the rain have a father? From whose belly forth came forth the ice? I'm going to skip down to. I'm going to skip, actually, why don't we, it starts here a few verses before chapter 39, but let's just look at the animal imagery here, and that'll sort of be our last reflection point for the night until we kind of close with our kind of final moment here. But right, there's all this stuff happening in the spheres and in the movement of the earth, but then God starts talking about all of the animals, and there are, oh gosh, we need hours just to unpack all of the different things that happen here, but let's just listen to some of the language. Hatatsud lelavi taref v'chayat kfirim. Can you hunt the prey for the lion and satisfy the appetite of the king of beasts? Ki yashochu b'monot yeshvu v'asuka lamo arev. Can you hunt prey for, they crouch in their dens, lie in ambush in their lairs. I'll read the English first, it's easier for me that way. Who provides food for the raven when his young cry out to God and wander about without food. Mi yachin la'orev tzedo, ki yaladav el yishaveu yit'u livli ochel. Do you know the season when the mountain goats give birth? Can you mark the time when the hinds calve? Hayadata eit ledet ya'alei sala, cholel ayalot tishmor. Can you count the months they must complete? You know the season they give birth. Tispor yerachim timalaena, v'yadata eit lidtana. When they couch to bring forth their offspring to deliver their young. Tichrena yaldehen, tifalachna, chevlehen, tishalachna. Their young are healthy. They grow up in the open. They leave and return no more. Yachlemu v'nehem yirbu vavar, yatzu v'lo shavu lamo. Who sets the wild ass free? Who loosens the bonds of the onager? Mishilach perech chofshi umosrot arud mi fiteach. Whose home I have made the wilderness, the salt land, his dwelling place. Asher samti arava beito umishkenotav melecha. And on and on and on would the wild ox agree to serve you. Would you rely on his? The wing of the ostrich beats joyously. Are her pinions and plumage like the storks? Knaf rananim ne'elsa, im evra chasida v'notza. This is actually, okay, this is the last thing we'll read. Let's read about the ostrich here, because there's something interesting that happens here so we're seeing the animals and their movements and who provides for them in their seasons and what they need. And then the wings of the ostrich beat joyously, but she's different from the stork. She leaves her eggs on the ground, letting them warm in the dirt. Forgetting they may be crushed underfoot or trampled by a wild beast. Her young are cruelly abandoned as if they were not hers. Her labor is in vain for lack of concern. And that's a bad translation. Bli pachad, because she has no fear. For God deprived her of wisdom, gave her no share of understanding. Ki hisha Eloah chokhmah, lo chalak la bina. So that's interesting. Like, these animals, on the one hand, are greater proof, greater testament to the wonder of this creation, how God is overseeing it all. But the animals are also dumb. They are also unafraid. They are also without wisdom. We are the ones, right, who are supposed to have wisdom, who are supposed to have understanding. That's the whole tension here. The natural world goes on about its business. The animals aren't complaining that they get slaughtered all the time by other animals, right? And God has the mastery of it, but we're stuck in the middle. We like have some wisdom, but not enough to get why we suffer, right? So again, I have no good questions, but now we've entered those animals into the mix. Let's try and hear for a couple last voices that we have. Payam.
You know, in poetry, the answer is usually not what's in written, not what's in what is written, but what's not written. And I think in this, you know, I'd say God is supposed to be the villain, because I see the point almost as like, you can't live on high. You can't be on this ivory tower. Like, you have to come on down to the people. And that's why the compassion is missing on this, because you have this, you know, aloof presence of almost like kingly presence, who's just like, okay, I've done all this great stuff, but it's like, but have you done the small things in life? And I think that's sort of the point of it, is that you have to come down, be in the mud with the people, and that's how you get the compassion. If one's here and one's here, then you miss the compassion, you miss the humanity of it.
Yeah, I'm hearing a strain in this conversation, which is really interesting. I think it started with Esra, where maybe this is a book about how God doesn't get it. Maybe this is a book about, one way of reading this is, God just doesn't understand. That's not God's realm. God's like, but look, I created everything, you know? I set the lines of existence itself. Do you ever, you know what a quark is? I made that, you know? Like, maybe, but God doesn't, I am saying, yeah, but come on down here. Live like us. You get everything, but you don't get anything. And on that note, I want to end at least where the break in God's kind of like great speech breaks, because God stops in the middle, and actually, you know, I hope maybe I have to run to another meeting, but at 7, which is why I have to leave right on time tonight. But maybe, I mean, this group is capable of discussing by yourself, so maybe Andrea will stay on for a little longer. I don't know. I don't want to hold her to that. But let's just look at this last moment. I'm sorry I didn't get through everything. The poetry here is just so good. But okay, then there's the horse. Did you give the horse his strength? And the hawk and the eagle. Does the eagle soar at your command? And on and on and on. And then it stops. And chapter 40 begins. Again, V'yan Adonai et Iyov v'yomar. That's how we started. And the Eternal One said in reply to Job, although Job's not been speaking. And he says, Harovim Shaddai Yisur, Mochiach Eloha Yanana. Shall one who has been disciplined complain against Shaddai? He who arraigns God, he who challenges God, must respond. And that is fascinating, as Michal pointed out early on, as we've seen. This is all framed in the language of back and forth, of dialogue. God has made God's case. And now he stops for a minute, and then he's going to go on for another 2 chapters. And we're going to see next week, how does Job respond? But I guess I want to leave by asking, what do you think about that? That God suddenly turns to Job and says, how do you respond? And I guess, you know, before we see how Job responds, I want to know, well, how would you respond to all of that? And I guess we've been doing that all along, but this is, in these last moments, God is saying something quite remarkable. The one who challenges God has to have a case, right? To use that legalistic language again. I made my case. What's your case? It's a fascinating move there to bring Job in and say, okay, respond to me. And this is the way God set it up from the start. Okay, so there are a lot of hands up. Andrea, will you take the hands that are up? And
hi, I actually have a meeting also at 7, but I would be happy to make someone else the host, and then everybody can stick around.
Would folks like to stick around? Yeah, just for another 10 minutes. It doesn't matter what I say. You should. I'm going to miss hearing you, but if someone would agree to be the co-host.
So I don't want to put Hannah on the spot, but she's done some hosting for us before.
Can you do it?
I can do it. Are you up for it? Okay.
Do it. All right. I'm sorry to leave you. I will look at this tape as it plays, and I will return. I will return unto you, saith the Lord, next week, and we'll see sort of part 2 about God's great speech, which is even worse. Okay, good night, everyone, and thank you so much for being with me. And I'm sorry I have to run right on time tonight. We'll keep going. Job has got a hold of us, and he's not going to let go. Okay, I'll see ya.
Okay, everybody, let's do it. Okay, I'm gonna start with people who maybe haven't spoken recently. So let's go back to you, Noah. Is your hand still up from before, or this is new? Noah, are you with us?
I don't have anything, sorry.
Oh, okay, all good, all good, all good. Michal, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, this has been playing out in the chat a little bit, but I think what gets lost when we talk about just God's response, and Matt brought this up in the chat as well, is that what it does is it allows us to ignore the way the book was set up from the start, which is God sets Job up and tortures him in every possible way. Job says, "This is awful." And then God says, "How dare you?" And it's beautiful poetry. I mean, it really is stunning and overwhelming. And if you can divorce that dynamic and take it on its own, it really could be this expression of God's greatness. And it's a wonderful expansion on the Genesis story. And it's really quite beautiful. But once you put that back in, for me, it's impossible not to see this as really an abuse of power.
Mm-hmm.
To say, I'm going to put you through all this. You're going to come to me and I'm going to say, "How dare you say that to me?"
Right.
And I don't think we can ignore that. I think it really takes away from our understanding of the book to try and make it into something that doesn't take that into account.
Great. Thank you. Yonatan?
There was something that Yael said early on that's really stuck with me, and I think it is proven to be true. Yael suggested that maybe what's going on here isn't that God is speaking, but that Job thinks God is speaking. And I think the text has these two different sections, right? It's like God spoke out of the storm, and then God spoke. We actually see a repeat of those sections later. And I want to propose the reading that what God says out of the storm is this projection that Job has of what Job thinks God is saying, right? Like the feelings that Job has tied up in, like, well, God is this powerful, incredible, being. And God says a whole lot less than that.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too deep into my textual basis for saying that, but I really think that bears out.
Great. Kathy?
Yeah, I was were particularly responding to Michal, but also to others. I wanted just to raise this whole question of the relationship of the very beginning and the very end, the kind of narrative part that are written so differently and seem like they were add-ons. And so to read it both ways, to read the heart of it without that beginning and that end, and then adding them, because to me it seems like the beginning and the end were just additions at some later time to try to make sense of things. And actually, the end is like, it seems to trivialize everything that takes place earlier. It's sort of like, oh, he has his children back and he has twice as much wealth. And so, okay, to me, this sort of idea that actually they're two completely different works, Job, the heart of it, and then this kind of additional stuff, which really does make it either abusive or it makes it into a kind of a simplistic, oh yeah, he got his reward in the end. So, and I think what it's trying to do is by adding that stuff, it it shows the limits of our conceptions of morality as human beings. In other words, we've got to have the little happy ending at the end or else we can't take it. And so it's actually, it almost proves the point of the middle, which is, you know, morality is not that simple. I don't know. Anyway, I just wanted to raise those issues.
Thanks, Kathy. Yael.
Yes, this
is a fabulous class. I'm so excited with everyone who's here. I treasure all of you. I think the storm is Job's makot, is the suffering. And I think the beginning of this story is not Satan walking up and down and speaking to God. I think the beginning of the story is Job suffering these hardships. And what he's trying to do, again, getting back to this theory of him wrestling with himself, is saying, well, God's testing me. Satan, this is a story that happens frequently in our legends, that Satan says, you know what, why don't you ask Abraham to sacrifice his son or do this? And Job is immersed in this. He lives this. So he says, you know what, I'm being tested. And then he says, this is really hard to bear. I can't bear it anymore. And I think then he has these theories that calm him. But the thing that I'm getting to, it's my theology, and I guess I need to believe this.
Great, we'll take it.
I need to believe that Hashem, there's a plan. And I think God's answers are, there's a plan, I'm here, you can't figure it out. But he doesn't say this in an angry way, because when we face suffering in our lives, as we all do, we say, I can't make any heads or tails of this. My loved one just died. But we really don't even know if death is the end. We don't know how. Maybe this person had to die so that the person taking care of them while they died would be influenced, and that would change them in some way. So I guess to put it in a nutshell, that God might be saying these things through tears, and God might be saying, there's a plan, I'm here.
Thanks. I love the insight into your theology a little bit. Jamie?
I think I just want to mirror what I think a lot of people have been saying, which is this is just sort of a God of reality. Like, this is how life is, that good people suffer tremendously and get no answers for it and are expected to still believe in a God that is compassionate. And I sometimes think that this is, this Job is like the countertext to so many other things that we have in our tradition that say you must believe that God is compassionate and all compassionate and loving. And this is just written by someone who says, I've sort of had enough of that. And we need to tell things from the other side. And so it's extreme, and it completely excises the idea of mercy from God. But it speaks to a part of reality that doesn't necessarily get as much play.
Thanks. Jen and Clara, you still have your hand up? No? Okay. You're like, please don't. No. Okay. Miriam?
I was thinking about the fact that the animals don't have wisdom and we have wisdom. And did Job not want to have wisdom so he couldn't suffer? And I don't think so, because we have wisdom, we have to suffer also, or we have to have the consequence of suffering. Whereas the animals, just went on and, their little ones died or whatever. So,
Right.
I don't know.
None of us do, none of us do. Thanks, Miriam. Emil, you still have your hand up from before, or you have more things?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, like,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, right. It seems streamlined because it all comes from the same character, right? Like the kind of abuse and then the comfort. But I feel like if we go through this sort of thing in real life, we also have to accept that it all comes from the same source, right? So it doesn't. so I can't agree with the idea that it's like the abusive professor, because it seems like yeah, eventually you're moving to this place where you're just like, I don't understand anything, but somehow in that there's some understanding, you know, like in this kind of giant mess, but from like a bird's eye view, you're just part of a bigger mess. And I was saying, like, it's the nature stuff to me seems like a dark version of that psalm we did a few weeks ago, where it's like, instead of like the badger in the rock and the thing in the place, it's like, yeah, they're stupid birds. They're like walking, they don't know anything, you know, they're killing each other, you know, but that's the reality in which we live, you know. And maybe there's something, I don't know about comforting, but there's something about close observation, at least. So it's not just like language, it's like, you know, when you see this with your own eyes, I don't know, there's something remarkable about that. But yeah, but like, I don't know, there's some satisfaction in the lack of satisfaction, maybe.
Esra?
Yeah, I can see, you know, it's like I'm listening to all the comments, and it's like I can see like we're pulled between this desire to make sense of things from God's perspective, and then like I can hear in the commentary in this class, you know, folks are like, no, this is abusive, and like, no, but God sees the bigger picture. And I'm all about like the dialectical coexistence of different realities, but I think I'm still left very disturbed by this and uncomfortable. And I think I'm okay with just kind of accepting the discomfort, because I guess it's like, okay, if you want to have a relationship with God, what kind of a God is this? I think, Emil, you had said earlier, or maybe you commented in the chat, like, oh, maybe this depends on the tone of how we read it. And then Yael said, you know, maybe God's saying this with tears in God's eyes, you know, anthropomorphizing God, fine. But the response is so long. If we imagine this to be a conversation with someone, and if I were Job, I would say, look, I never even cursed you. I'm just saying, woe is me, because I've been like trampled on by life. And God responds with this heavy barrage. I mean, it's almost like a diatribe. It just goes and goes and goes with a lot of detail and a lot of, you know, it's hard to imagine someone going on that long with tears through their eyes and with a soft tone. It's hard to imagine. I would argue that the text itself is presenting us with something where that interpretation would be a stretch. So I just, I'm still left with like, so are we learning from this that God is inconsistent? Because if I were Job and I said, look, you were at least compassionate before, you described yourself with 13 divine attributes of mercy. So couldn't God say, look, there are things that you don't know about the universe, but I'm sorry for your pain, and your pain is real. You know, and maybe that's too much a 2020 kind of, but can't God just validate the pain at least, you know? And we never get that. So I'm bothered by that, by the lack of comfort. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not alone in that, for sure. Allison?
Yeah, I resonate with what Isra was just saying. And then it kind of made me think, you know, because I was like nodding along with you, Isra. And then I thought, yeah, but God gets angry. Like, it's not like this is the first time that God has been inconsistent or cruel. You know, sort of like throughout the Torah, God sometimes like goes into a rage and destroys things and then regrets it, you know? Like we recently read like the Noah story, where God says, like, I will never do that again. I will never destroy the world again. But then God like does kind of destroy entire cultures and whole peoples and metes out, you know, a fair amount of destruction. And since it's almost like, well, what do we do with that? Like it's interesting to like have this type of struggle. Yeah, and maybe it's a way of understanding like the fact that we live in this world that is where we are fundamentally vulnerable, and any one of us could at any moment be hit with disasters, like health disasters, natural disasters, even like psychological disasters, you know? There are so many different things that can fall us, and you know, like we don't get apologies, you know, like the earthquake is never going to come back and say, I'm so sorry for your pain. It just is.
Yeah. Thanks, Allison. Michal?
I want to respond to Allison, and Allison, that was really quite beautiful. And to say that, you know, we're looking for mercy here, but there is a whole strain within the Tanakh of Yirat Elohim. So the fear of God.
Can you just, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. I'm always going to translate. And that we are expected to be in a relationship with God in which fear, and it's not fear in the way that we think of it in terms of fear of the dark, but let's just call it fear and like, you know, being overwhelmed in that kind of fearful way is the appropriate relationship with the divine. That is a real strand. And I think that's what you're talking to, Allison, or speaking to, I should say, when you talk about, you know, the fact that the God of the Bible often is quite destructive, and that it really is on some level that the story of the Bible on one level, there are many different ways to look at it, but on one level is about God's power. And power is often destructive. And we are supposed to be in relation with that power from a subservient position. It's just that that's uncomfortable for us, not just because we live in 2020, but because it's uncomfortable, but also because if we look at the book of Job, it seems so deliberate. It seems so pointed and personal. And, you know, I'm not speaking to how we should interpret that, but just to say that that can be put into a much larger narrative strain within the canon of the Bible.
Thank you.
That's it.
That was great. Any last thoughts from anybody? Anyone who hasn't shared or who has shared and has more things to share before we close? Okay. Oh, Miriam, yeah.
As much as, you know, if we go through a pain that God says it's a plan that he has, and that may give comfort to people, but when you're in your sorrow, it doesn't give you comfort, even though you know it's God's plan, and who knows what God's plan is. You know, you wish that you had such a belief in God that would help you get through your pain and suffering, you know, and lucky is the person that has such belief.
Amen.
Not many people have that, so, but that could help you get through your suffering.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
I am not Rabbi David Kasher, so I'm not going to say anything, but I'll see a lot of you tomorrow, probably in Parsha class, and have a great night, everybody. Always good to see you all and learn with you, and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for
Brilliant
hosting, Hannah.
ideas.
Thank
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.